The first US dollar, USD, is one of the world's strongest currencies. It is the official currency of the United States as well as several other countries. Although it has a deep-rooted history in the United States, the dollar as we know it today was first printed in 1914. So in this video, we are going to discuss the US dollar is no longer the world reserve currency. Now before we get into this video, make sure to hit that subscribe button and leave a comment below saying I subscribed. I will try my best to reply to as many comments as possible. The dollar is losing its supremacy in the global monetary system as many countries are now looking to strengthen their own currencies. Since the end of World War II, the US dollar has served as the primary reserve currency globally, leaving little room for other currencies to grow as an alternative monetary system. Currently, central banks hold about 60% of their foreign exchange reserves in American dollars, and about half of international trade, loans, and global debt securities are invoiced in US dollars. In foreign exchange markets, where currencies are traded, the dollar is involved in nearly 90% of all transactions. In 2014, however, the currency began to lose reserve status as Russia and China joined hands to de-dollarize its business dealings. The move was made in response to the imposition of Western sanctions following Moscow's annexation of Crimea, which restricted the ability of state-owned businesses and banks to raise capital in Western markets. The US dollar becomes the world's reserve currency. The US dollar was officially crowned the world's reserve currency and was backed by the world's largest gold reserves thanks to the Bretton Woods Agreement. Instead of gold reserves, other countries accumulated reserves of US dollars. Needing a place to store their dollars, countries began buying US Treasury securities, which they considered to be a safe store of money. The demand for Treasury securities, coupled with the deficit spending needed to finance the Vietnam War and the Great Society domestic programs, caused the United States to flood the market with paper money. With growing concerns over the stability of the dollar, the countries began to convert dollar reserves into gold. The demand for gold was such that President Richard Nixon was forced to intervene and de-link the dollar from gold, which led to the floating exchange rates that exist today. Although there have been periods of stagflation, which is defined as high inflation and high unemployment, the US dollar has remained the world's reserve currency. Countries to ditch the dollar. In the last 2 decades, the US dollar has lost over 12 percentage points of market share, from 71% to 59% in 2022. Moscow has rapidly intensified its usage of the yuan via 2 main channels, raising the yuan's percentage in Russia's reserves and switching to direct ruble-yuan commerce, rather than utilizing the dollar as an intermediary. The Russian Finance Ministry raised the authorized percentage of yuan reserves in the National Wealth Fund to 60% at the end of the previous year. The Brazilian government also announced on Wednesday that China and Brazil have agreed to trade directly in their own national currencies, forgoing the use of the US dollar as an intermediary. The agreement will enable China, the top rival to US economic hegemony, and Brazil, the largest economy in Latin America, to conduct their extensive trade and financial transactions directly, exchanging yuan for reais, which is the Brazilian real, and vice versa instead of going through the US dollar. China and India, 2 of the largest economies in Asia, have launched separate programs in an effort to lessen the US dollar's dominance over international trade and enable them to settle transactions in their own currencies. The Reserve Bank of India, RBI, last week permitted central banks from 18 countries, including Tanzania, Kenya, and Uganda, to open special Vostra rupee accounts, which will allow them to settle payments in Indian rupees as part of a significant effort to de-dollarize trade. Russia has also advocated for the de-dollarization of trade and the use of the Indian rupee. In response to the sanctions the West had placed on Russia for invading Ukraine, the Kremlin likewise began requesting payments be made in the ruble. The US dollar today. The dollar remains the world's reserve currency today. Central banks hold around 59% of their reserves in US dollars, according to the International Monetary Fund, IMF. Many of the reserves are in cash or US bonds, such as US Treasuries. Dollar-denominated debt outside the U.S. continues to rise, with levels reaching $13.4 trillion as of mid-2022. Most people would believe that this makes the dollar the strongest currency in the world. Despite its position in the global markets and how dependent they are on it, the dollar ranked as the 10th strongest currency, according to CMC Markets. The site ranked the Kuwaiti dinar as the strongest currency, while the British pound and the euro earned the 5th and 8th spots respectively. Printing began a year after the establishment of the Federal Reserve as the nation's central bank with the passing of the Federal Reserve Act. That's when the Fed started issuing Federal Reserve notes in $10 denominations featuring Andrew Jackson's portrait. 3 decades later, the dollar officially became the world's reserve currency. However, its ascendancy to the throne actually began not long after the ink was dry on that first printing in 1914. History of the U.S. dollar. The first documented use of paper currency in the U.S. dates back to 1690, when colonial notes were issued by the Massachusetts Bay Colony. These notes were used to fund military operations. It wasn't until 1776 that the first $2 bill was introduced, 9 days before independence. 9 years later, in 1785, the U.S. officially adopted the dollar sign, using the symbol for the Spanish-American peso as a guide. In 1863, the government established the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, OCC, and the National Currency Bureau. These two agencies were charged with handling new banknotes. Centralized printing begins at the Bureau of Engraving and Printing in 1869. Prior to this, money was printed by private companies. The U.S. Treasury assumed the official responsibility of issuing the nation's legal tender in 1890, more than a decade before the creation of the Federal Reserve and the dollar as we know it today. The Federal Reserve Act of 1913 created the Federal Reserve Bank to respond to the unreliability and instability of a currency system that was previously based on banknotes issued by individual banks. This was the same time that the U.S. economy became the world's largest, surpassing that of the United Kingdom. The majority of developed countries pegged their currencies to gold as a way to stabilize currency exchanges. But when World War I broke out in 1914, many countries suspended their use of the gold standard to pay their military expenses with paper money, which devalued their currencies. Britain, though, held to the gold standard to maintain its position as the world's leading currency and found itself borrowing money for the first time during the third year of the war. The United States became the lender of choice for many countries that wanted to buy dollar-denominated U.S. bonds. Britain finally abandoned the gold standard in 1931, which decimated the bank accounts of international merchants who traded in pounds. By then, the dollar replaced the pound as the leading international reserve currency. The IMF's top official has warned of a decrease in the U.S. currency's dominance in global markets after imposing sanctions on Russia. Gita Gopinath, first deputy managing director of the International Monetary Fund, IMF, has warned of a gradual decrease of the dominance of the U.S. dollar in the world financial systems after the unprecedented financial sanctions imposed on Russia after its incursion in Ukraine. The sanctions, from restrictions on Russian banks to measures targeting its economy imposed by Western nations, could cause a more fragmented international monetary system. The dollar would remain the major global currency even in that landscape, but fragmentation at a smaller level is certainly quite possible, Gopinath told the Financial Times. The decision is the last step of Russia's long campaign to reduce its dependence on the dollar. Although the U.S. currency has an outsized role in global markets, its dominance has been gradually decreasing in the last 2 decades. According to a recent IMF report on dollar dominance in global markets, the share of reserves held in U.S. dollars by central banks has dropped by 12 percentage points since the turn of the century, from 71% in 1999 to 59% in 2021. The decline of U.S. dollar dominance is not the result of reserve accumulation by a small number of large reserve holders with a preference for non-dollar currencies. Rather, the IMF sees the active portfolio diversification by central bank reserve managers as the main reason for this decline. The share of non-traditional reserve currencies, defined as currencies other than the US dollar, euro, Japanese yen, and British pound sterling, rose from negligible levels at the turn of the century to roughly $1.2 trillion and 10% of total identified reserves in 2021. Let us know your opinion in the comments section below. This was all for today. Hope you liked the video. Subscribe to our channel and stay tuned for more interesting videos. Stay safe, and we will be back soon with another video.